Test 4, Part 2, Passage 1. Listen to a conversation between a student and a university fitness center manager. Good afternoon. Are you Brenda Davis?
Yeah, that's me. Are you Owen, the guy who's looking for a part-time job here?
I think you have me confused with someone else. I'm Steve. I emailed you a couple days ago. I'm on the student council. I mentioned I'd try to stop in today, and I was hoping I could take a couple minutes of your time.
Well, I'm waiting for someone to come in for an interview really soon, but I can chat until he gets here.
Great. I'll get down to it. The student council, we have a suggestion form on our website that students can use to submit ideas on how to improve campus life, what extra services they'd like to have, things like that. It's a great way for us to gather feedback from the students and address their needs. Anyway, lots of students wrote in about the gym.
Nothing bad, I hope. We try to provide great service to everyone on campus, professors, students, even non-academic staff.
Oh, don't worry. It's nothing to do with service. It's that, well, the gym closes really early, 9 p.m. on weekdays and even earlier on Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah, but we open really early in the morning.
It's just that students, a lot of us have part-time jobs in the evening or night classes, and we're almost always busy during the day, so it'd be great if the gym were open later. Also, lots of college students are night owls. It makes more sense to stay open late. Have you considered extending your operating hours, say, until midnight?
Well, you have to understand that just like any other department at the university, we have our own operating budget that we must adhere to. I'd love to stay open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We just can't afford to do that, though. Every additional hour we stay open means more money spent on electricity, more staff we need to pay, more use of the equipment, and as a result, more maintenance. As they say, time is money.
I understand what you're saying, but you could still stay open late without having to be open for more hours.
How do you propose we do that?
Easy. There must be a few hours that are downtime, when not many people go to the gym. I guess some people go in the morning before class or work or whatever. But what about in the early afternoon, after lunch? Like between 1 and 3. Who goes to the gym then?
You'd be surprised. We are able to track how many students use the gym each day and at what time because they have to swipe their ID cards. It's a security measure. And the slowest time here is actually between 8 and 9. Almost twice as many students come between 1 and 2 or 2 and 3. Remember that lots of students have classes that end in the early afternoon, like between 1 and 3. And before they have lunch, a lot of them stop in at the gym for a workout.
I guess I didn't really consider that. So my suggestion wasn't as good as I thought it was. But there must be some way we can accommodate the people who want to go to the gym late.
I'll do some thinking about it. It would just take too much money. The university really doesn't have any to spare these days.
Well, how about this? Your personal training services and classes like yoga bring in extra money, right? Well, if you offered some special classes late at night and maybe some discounted training sessions or something, that could help offset the cost of staying open later.
That's possible, but more than likely what would happen is that fewer people would take classes or do training at regular times.
So you'd still end up losing money. I get it.
Anyway, I'll try to come up with something. In fact, we have a staff meeting tomorrow. I'll mention it to everyone then and see if anyone has suggestions.
I'd appreciate that. I'll stop by later this week to follow up, if that's okay.
I'm here every day, Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. Feel free to drop in.
Sounds good. By the way, while I'm here, do you mind if I ask you some questions about the personal training services?
Go for it. I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Now, get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer. 1. Why does the student visit the fitness center? 'Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question. There must be a few hours that are downtime when not many people go to the gym. I guess some people go in the morning before class or work or whatever, but what about in the early afternoon, after lunch, like between 1 and 3? Who goes to the gym then?
You'd be surprised. We are able to track how many students use the gym each day and at what time because they have to swipe their ID cards. You know it's a security measure, and the slowest time here is actually between 8 and 9.
2. Why does the manager say this?
You'd be surprised.
Three. What reason does the manager give for the fitness center's limited hours? Four. What does the manager say about adding late classes and personal training sessions? Five. What did the manager indicate she will do about the student's concern?
Test 4, Part 2, Passage 2. Listen to part of a lecture on audio technology. So today I'm going to talk about recording technology. You know, recording technology has evolved over the past 50 or 60 years. We went from records to cassette tapes to CDs and then to MP3s. Not too long ago, I used to make mixtapes for my friends on cassettes. It wasn't like today when you can download any song within seconds.
Most of us probably have experience with cassette tapes, though. I definitely have. I owned a bunch of them as a kid. I used to make copies of them with an old tape recorder.
Yep, that was the most common way to do it. But I guess most of you don't know how tapes are actually made. Recording tape was developed as early as the 1890s. Eventually, a German company named IG Farben created a soft magnetic tape that was treated with iron oxide. See, they'd actually put iron oxide in these huge mills and mix it with chemicals. Once it was finished, the liquid mixture was stored until it was applied in thin layers over a plastic film about 3 feet wide. The wet tape was exposed to a magnetic field that aligned the oxide particles, and then it was dried and cut into thin, usable pieces.
I have a quick question. I thought sound was a series of vibrations. I mean, how does tape record vibrations?
I was just about to explain that. In this form of analog recording, the audio signal is a vibration that is converted into a magnetic field on the tape. Well, let me back up. First, the sound waves vibrate a small device in the recording microphone. These waves are changed into an electric current. This current is then converted into a magnetic area on the tape. Cool, huh? Unfortunately, when you copied a tape, That recopied signal would be transferred, so recopied again, onto the magnetic tape. It's like making a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. Eventually, the sound quality of the tape became so bad that it rendered the songs unlistenable. This type of recording actually lasted until the 80s, when CDs were invented. There were two types of CDs that became popular: CDRs and CDRWs. CDRs had a coating of dye, and on top of that was a coating of some metal, usually containing silver, which would be altered by a laser. See, this coating on a new CDR created a completely reflective surface, and a laser could write data on the CDR's surface by creating minuscule non-reflective bumps. This change in the surface was permanent, and CDRs could only be written once. CDRWs, on the other hand, used a special dye layer that covered the surface of the disc. This layer could change its transparency depending on temperature, so it could either be transparent or cloudy. Well, when the light from the laser heated up this surface, it became more transparent, sort of like starting with a blank sheet of paper. Because of this, the data on the CD could be rewritten over and over again, and the original sound quality was always retained.
But I had a bunch of CDs that I made, and a lot of them don't work anymore, especially the CDRWs. Is that normal?
Unfortunately, it is. Because the coating is designed to be written and erased repeatedly, it's more susceptible to naturally occurring chemical reactions, like exposure to sunlight, for example. It's not good to expose CDRWs to too much sunlight. Why? Because if that surface dye gets too hot, it starts to change the data that's stored there. Additionally, over time, the dye on a CDRW loses its reflectivity, so lasers can't read the data stored on it.
You mean there's no perfect way to store them? I mean, libraries can preserve old books and documents because they control the humidity and temperature.
Sure, there are certain things you can do. It's similar to what you just mentioned. They need to be stored at specific levels of humidity and at certain temperatures. But we're talking about CDs. Music. Who is going to go to all that trouble?
I guess it's good we moved on to MP3s.
Well, yeah, I'd say so. MP3s definitely have advantages over the other formats, but nothing's perfect. They're almost always compressed, which means a little bit of data is lost in order to make the files way smaller. They are created using a compression technique that mimics the human ear. For example, there are sounds we can't hear, and certain sounds that we hear much better than others. This determines which sounds are erased and which are kept during the compression process. So some of the song is actually lost, but it's almost imperceptible. Still, CDs have better sound quality. On the other hand, people could make copies of tapes and CDs for their friends, but with MP3s, thousands or even millions of people can download a song that's been posted online. So, MP3s, the big advantage they do have is that they can theoretically preserve music forever. That's why lots of people have moved their entire libraries to their computers instead of keeping old tapes, CDs, and vinyl recordings. And as long as they're backed up properly, there's no risk of losing them. Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer. 6. What is the lecture mainly about? Seven. Why does the professor mention photocopies? 'Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
You mean there's no perfect way to store them? I mean, libraries can preserve old books and documents because they control the humidity and temperature.
Sure, there are certain things you can do. It's similar to what you just mentioned. They need to be stored at specific levels of humidity and at certain temperatures. But we're talking about CDs. Music. Who is going to go to all that trouble? 8. What does the professor imply when he says this? But we're talking about CDs. Music. Who is going to go to all that trouble? Nine. Why does the professor mention the human ear? Ten. According to the professor, what is the reason so much music is stored on computers? (11) In the lecture, the professor describes various types of media. Indicate whether each of the following is a characteristic of cassette tapes, CDs, or MP3s.
Test 4, Part 2, Passage 3. Listen to part of a lecture in a history class. Okay, we've been talking about the Great Depression. As I mentioned last class, the U.S. had gone through economic downturns before, but the Great Depression was unique because it forced millions of Americans into poverty. Does anyone remember why this economic crisis was so severe?
It was the stock market crash of 1929, right? The financial panic that followed led to bank failures and widespread unemployment.
Well, that was a factor, but the collapse of the financial markets was soon followed by a severe drought throughout much of the American Midwest. Crops failed, farms were foreclosed, and many tenant farmers were forced off the land. This put an unbelievable strain on an already weakened economy. What I want to discuss today is how the U.S. government responded to the Great Depression. In particular, I want to examine the role of President Hoover, who I believe has been unfairly blamed for not doing enough to manage this economic crisis. There is a widely held misconception that Hoover was reluctant to intervene during the Great Depression because of his ideological commitment to small government and laissez-faire economic policies. This is based on a refusal to provide direct financial aid to individual citizens through the creation of federal welfare programs. Yes?
Why was he so opposed to this? Didn't he realize that many people needed help?
Well, Hoover firmly believed that this sort of assistance should be provided by charitable organizations. He thought that welfare programs would make people dependent on the government. Anyway, Hoover became a national scapegoat for the Great Depression. In fact, the term Hooverville was commonly used to describe the shanty towns that were built by homeless people during this period. Like I said, though, the popular perception of Hoover isn't very accurate. Hoover actually intervened more aggressively in the U.S. economy than any previous president. take his efforts to provide assistance to farmers. This was a priority for Hoover because farmers had been suffering throughout much of the 1920s due to low crop prices. In 1929, Hoover created the Federal Farm Board, a government agency with a budget of $500 million. This organization attempted to stabilize crop prices by buying and storing agricultural surpluses before they went on the open market. It also provided funds to farm cooperatives. Hoover firmly believed that farmers who worked together in formal cooperatives could manage the production and sale of agricultural products more efficiently and profitably. Hoover also tried to protect farmers from foreclosure by increasing funding for the Federal Land Bank system in 1932. Using these funds, Federal Land Bank was able to provide individual farmers with low-interest loans to pay off their debts with private banks. Hoover established another agency in 1932 called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Its purpose was to provide financial support to companies that were considered vital to the national interest. Initially, it offered low-interest loans to banks, railroads, insurance companies, and mortgage companies. However, 6 months after its creation, the agency's powers were broadened so that it could provide aid directly to state governments. The organization was so effective that although it was only intended to remain in operation for 10 years, it ended up lasting until 1957. Now, Hoover wasn't just concerned with helping farmers and business owners. He also understood that something had to be done to aid the unemployed. By 1932, there were over 12 million people without jobs. So how did Hoover try to deal with this problem? Well, the solution he came up with was public works projects. Throughout his presidency, Hoover authorized the spending of large sums to build or improve government properties. Can anyone give me an example of one of these projects?
The Hoover Dam? I'm pretty sure construction started at around this time.
Yes, that's the most famous one. Now, some estimates place Hoover's public works spending at around $500 million per year during his term in office. These projects provided employment to thousands of Americans, and Hoover also took steps to ensure that these workers were treated fairly. In 1931, he signed the Davis-Bacon Act into law. This legislation made it mandatory for companies that received contracts for public works projects to pay their employees fair wages.
Excuse me, but why was Hoover so unsuccessful in his efforts to deal with the Great Depression? I mean, it seems like he tried a lot of different things, but the Depression lasted for several years after he left office.
That's a great question. Do you remember what I mentioned earlier about Hoover's refusal to create federal welfare programs? Well, that was definitely a bad decision. Poverty was so widespread during the Great Depression that private charities simply couldn't cope. Another thing to keep in mind is that many of the programs Hoover did implement were limited in scope. They were the right approach, but weren't done on a grand enough scale to have a significant effect. But this doesn't mean that they didn't benefit the American people. In fact, some historians argue that Hoover laid the groundwork that made it possible for his successor, President Roosevelt, to bring the Great Depression to an end. And this seems pretty likely when you consider how many of Hoover's programs were adopted and expanded by President Roosevelt. Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer. 12. What is the lecture mainly about? "13. Why does the professor mention Hoovervilles? 14. In the lecture, the professor describes the various actions taken by President Hoover in response to the Great Depression. Indicate whether each of the following is one of these actions. (15) According to the professor, what was the purpose of the Davis-Bacon Act? (16) What does the professor say about President Roosevelt? Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question. Does anyone remember why this economic crisis was so severe?
It was the stock market crash of 1929, right? The financial panic that followed led to bank failures and widespread unemployment.
Well, that was a factor, but the collapse of the financial markets was soon followed by a severe drought throughout much of the American Midwest. 17. What does the professor mean when he says this? Well, that was a factor,